Next up, at 2 mana value, this is where we start to have direct comparisons to old reliable Counterspell. And we're no longer considering conditions of softness or other things we may have had to accept due to the Counterspell being cheaper. Original Counterspell is a hard counter, it's unconditional, and it costs blue. Everything that we discuss in this mana value gets weighed against this. Negate has kind of become the modern equivalent, which switches to the cost of 1 and a blue, but also only works against non-creature spells. The next big 2 mana value counterspell I really want to look at is Mana Drain, the one which almost always gets brought up when comparing spells to Counterspell. It's just as hard of a counterspell, it's just as unconditional, it has an identical mana value and even the same mana cost. But it also gives you a burst of free mana on your next turn, allowing it to act as a sort of ritual. And it's still getting cut from many CEDH decks because blue can be difficult to hold up in the game. Mana Drain is an absolute blowout when it hits, and I'd honestly consider it very fair even in casual games of Commander. Yes, it can give you a massive ritual for your next turn to catapult you ahead, but it's a ritual, not a permanent boost to mana. For a player to really abuse Mana Drain, they need to have a way to spend that mana. And the size of the ritual scales with the mana value of spells that players are slinging. It's not something that a player can routinely count on, apart from the known mana values of players' commanders, which, as we already mentioned, countering commanders is not often a good course to victory, as they're going to get that spell back, they're not down a card. It's a very powerful counterspell, absolutely, but its primary use is defensive. The blue cost is harder to use offensively, and you're less likely to see another turn when you're going for it. If you do, the spells you're going to counter offensively are going to provide a lot less of a mana value for your ritual. Another 2 mana value counter, which sees a lot more play in CEDH, is actually Delay, which changes the formula by making a 2 mana value spell only costing a single colored mana, sort of like Negate. It's also a hard, unconditional counter, with the downside that the spell is exiled and suspended for 3 turns, which means that the spell's owner will eventually get to cast it for free. It's a powerful spell in CEDH where 3 turns from now might never happen because so many players are trying to win the game with 0-turn clocks. It does get worse in games where players are expecting to go into the long game. Muddle the Mixture also sees a significant amount of play in CEDH, less because of its power as a counterspell, because really, it's a very conditional counter that only hits instants and sorceries, which is below rate for a 2 mana value counterspell. But because it can be transmuted for 1 blue to tutor up any 2 mana value spell in your deck, that includes cards that can win the game. As I mentioned before, Thassa's Oracle, Tainted Pact, Underworld Breach. Muddle the Mixture trades its strength as a counterspell for the utility of acting as a tutor for key cards in your deck. Narset's Reversal is truly an odd duck of a counterspell because it behaves much more like a remand than true counterspells, putting the spell back into its owner's hand, which only buys you a turn, but it also gives you a copy of the spell. Narset's Reversal does have the standard cost of blue, and it only hits instants and sorceries. It doesn't do a lot of good when you're trying to protect your board from a board wipe, but it could turn an overloaded Cyclonic Rift back on its owner. It becomes a spell that is truly situational, and you will most likely know if there's enough powerful instants and sorceries being thrown around in your metagame to really justify it. Unsubstantiate is another example of a pseudo counterspell, returning a spell or creature to its owner's hand for 1 and a blue. This is a very castable and very flexible piece of interaction. When you are playing a deck which is going for a very quick clock on your game plan, bouncing a spell back to its owner's hand is almost as good as countering it. And the fact that it can also remove a troublesome creature for a turn is a very nice upside. Another very odd card, which many brewers have been trying to find a home in CEDH for, is Counterbalance, an enchantment for blue, which allows you to reveal the top card of your library and counter a spell, if the mana value of your top deck matches the mana value of the spell being cast exactly. It requires a metagame with a fairly low mana curve to be effective, which is why there are so many brewers in CEDH looking to find a home for it. But it also requires additional setup in the form of top deck manipulation. Sensei's Dividing Top or a heavy focus on scrying will be critical in order to take advantage of this card. This is also the mana value where mana leaks come into play. Mana Leak was introduced all the way back in Stronghold when Wizards of the Coast was looking for ways to fix Counterspell, thus introducing a soft counterspell, which is unconditional but allows the controller of the spell targeted to buy their way out. The tax, which a soft counter at this level varies, from 3 mana, which is actually quite good, but even then still doesn't see a lot of play. Modern soft counters at the 2 mana value slot are often going to cost 1 or 2 extra mana on the tax for the person being targeted. And there are few soft counter spells which can have a tax of 4, but you have to meet some stronger setup cost. Overall, these see very little play outside of very specific decks in Commander, because the value of these cards plummet as the game goes on. If every player has 10 mana valuable, a tax of 3 gets a whole lot worse, to the point where it's basically a dead draw. Arcane Denial is a hard, unconditional counterspell for 1 and a blue which cantrips. Sounds too good to be true. Well, yep, it gives your opponent 2 cards at the beginning of the next upkeep as compensation for countering their spell. Looking at classic card advantage theory in Commander, this is actually a decent deal. You wind up card neutral to 2 of your opponents, and down 1 card compared to the person who you stopped. And if the spell you countered was important enough to counter, the cards they're drawing are probably worse than the card you just countered. Memory Lapse is also a fascinating bit of design. Another hard counterspell for 1 and a blue which has the downside of putting the card back on top of its owner's library. Pushing someone's sweeper back a turn can change the outcome of the game. But the longer the game goes, again, the less pushing someone's spell back by a single turn matters. I'm also going to give a quick mention to some off-color counterspells, Drown in the Loch and Dovin's Veto. The latter of which is basically a negate which is itself uncounterable with the added cost of needing a white mana. And the former is sort of bottlenecked early in the game until players have multiple cards in their graveyards, while still providing the upside of being usable as a creature removal spell. I quite like Drown in the Loch at higher powered games where players are more likely to be cracking fetch lands and playing lower mana value cards anyway to quickly fill up their graveyards and to be better targets for the spell overall. Quick honorable mentions to Izzet Charm and Dimir Charm. The former has a mode to be a less good mana leak while also being an expensive shock or a decent loot, while the latter could counter a sorcery in a pinch while also being a decent form of self-mill and a good way to destroy low-cost creatures. I also want to mention a few counterspells on legs, including Malevolent Hermit and Spellstutter Sprite. The latter sees very little play as very few decks lean on fairies as a significant, reliable tribe that they expect to have on board. The former, however, is sneakily a 3 mana value counterspell, and only against non-creature spells and only as a soft counter. But once you can disturb it back into play as a Benevolent Geist, it can be amazing, making all of your non-creature spells uncounterable, effectively acting as a perpetual, constant offensive counterspell for all of your non-creature spells. That's amazing! You'll know if your metagame is going to make Malevolent Hermit good if there are a lot of decks depending on non-creature spells, or you have a lot of ways you could potentially get it into your graveyard. Once you get into 3 mana value counterspells, you're going to be paying real mana for real spells. It's rare even in casual games to have 3 mana worth of spare change lying around to hold up, and it's the reason why a card like Cancel sees very little play in Commander. This, remember, is the modern unconditional hard counterspell. Most of the 3 mana value counterspells which do see play do so because they have a way to cheat on costs, or they will provide a specific, significant advantage when you cast them. Historically, cards like Spell Crumble and Hinder were game-changing counterspells, which could tuck a player's commander before the tuck rule change. Since that time, they don't really see a lot of play. But before the tuck rule change, this was a way to deny a player their commander perpetually, and fundamentally changed the way their decks could function. Today, very few 3 mana value counterspells see real play. Some decks will try to make use of a card like Forbid, though paying 1 blue to counter and having enough cards in hand to pitch for the buyback is a real cost. Low color blue decks can also make use of Archmage's Charm, which has several very powerful modes on it, enough so that it sees play in Modern. This is an area where Modern sets will often highlight a specific set mechanic, so you may choose to include one of those counterspells because of its synergy with your game plan. This is also where some cost reduction mechanics come into play, often requiring a setup cost of controlling specific permanent types, controlling a wizard, controlling a spirit, controlling artifacts, or enchantments. All of these cards exist, and it might be right for your deck, but only if you plan to see the game go long, and only if they fit with your deck's game plan. There are also plenty of multicolored charms which can perform counters as one of their modes. Just like I hinted at with Archmage's Charm, they only fit into decks which have the right color identities. But while you don't want to spend 3 mana to counter a spell most times, particularly not 3 colored mana, the modal nature of the card means that it is rarely a bad top deck, particularly late in the game when you can expect to have lots of mana to spend, and the flexibility can get you out of some tight situations. Counterspells on legs get really interesting at 3 mana value. Lol Mage Mentor can be a powerhouse in Merfolk decks, where you can easily establish a draw-go style control on the stack if you really want to. Though needing to tap 7 Merfolk to counter a spell can be a little difficult to set up, you do net a 1/1 Merfolk Wizard creature token every single time you successfully counter a spell using this activated ability, or any other counterspell we've talked about. If you're going to go wide enough, this can let you lock down the stack very well. Urtai, Wizard Adept, sees very little play. Why? Urtai has a tap in his activated ability, which means you need to wait a full turn cycle before you can make use of his ability, and then it's 4 mana and a tap to get 1 counterspell out of him. You really want to be in a draw-go style deck to make Urtai work, and as we discussed, that's really hard in multiplayer format like Commander to make work. Branching into multicolored creatures, Spell Queller deserves special mention as a unique Azorius option. A 2/3 flyer for 1 a white and a blue, which can exile a spell off the stack with a mana value of 4 or less. The hitch being that if Spell Queller leaves the battlefield, then your opponent can cast the spell they were trying to resolve before for free. It's a strange card, but a unique option, particularly if you're going to go into Spirit Tribal or Flying Tribal. And technically, if you want to go into a Blink style deck, or a deck with a lot of sacrifice outlets, you can do some shenanigans where you cast Spell Queller, put its ETB ability on the stack, then blink or bounce or sacrifice Spell Queller, triggering its leaves the battlefield ability. Just like the O-Ring trick, the exiled spell will then be exiled forever with no chance of ever being recast. There are very few counterspells which cost 4 mana or more which see regular play in Commander. Even cards which had previously made massive impacts on faster formats like Modern see very little play. Cryptic Command is a legitimately powerful spell with extremely powerful modes, but the cost is huge. And again, true draw-go style control decks are extremely difficult to make use of in Commander. I'd even argue that old powerhouses like Glenelendra Archmage have fallen out of favor, though Glenelendra actually can be a strong play in a mid-range deck, and people may be writing off this card prematurely. The upside to many of these expensive counterspells is that they'll put you up on cards, forcing you to pay more mana to overcome the inherent card disadvantage of 1-for-1ing a single one of your opponents. But it takes a lot of mana to be all set up, and to be able to multi-spell to both develop your board and hold up an expensive counterspell. The other upside among the big counterspells that often earns them a slot is that this is the cost where most modern interpretations of Mana Drain are costed. The multicolored Plasm Capture doesn't see much play, but the mono-blue Spell Swindle does. Variations of this include cards like Overwhelming Intellect, which can get you a big grip of cards, Access Denied can get you a swarm of Thopters, and Mystic Confluence is probably more played in Commander than Cryptic Command, because the mana cost is much easier to swallow, and the flexibility can get you the confident counterspell, or it can get you multiple cards and a soft counterspell, or a soft counter and a bounce and a cantrip. In which case, it's often better to think of these big spells more like a big ramp spell or a big draw spell, which are also incidentally going to knock an opponent back a turn. Shout out to Dana Roach from Commander Central and the EDH Recast for his conversations on Overwhelming Intellect, which kind of informed this part of the discussion. Just as with many 4+ mana value spells, these are going to be on the higher side of your mana curve and should have bigger impacts, which swing the game in a big way, putting you up and your opponents down. Try not to get greedy with them. When you're ready to cast them, try to take advantage of the first good opportunity where you get paid off for having that spell. Some of the more expensive counterspells also include the ability to counter a spell without actually countering it. Similar to Spell Queller, Commit to Memory can be cast for 3 and a blue to put a spell or permanent on top of its owner's library, so it can be an expensive piece of removal or an expensive counterspell. It has the upside that it can also be aftermathed for 4 blue to essentially Time Twister, shuffling everyone's hands and graveyards into their libraries and resetting everyone back to 7 cards in hand. 4 mana value is also the mana value that you can cast Venser Shaper Savant, being able to return a spell or permanent to its owner's hand while also being a creature, opening up some value lines using Bounce or Reanimation or Blink. Hullbreaker Horror is far more expensive, but essentially gives every spell you cast Venser's Claws, giving you extreme board and stack control, making it a potent option for decks that are trying to cheat it into play, whether with Polymorph or Reanimation. And over 6,000 words later, we'll bring our discussion of counterspells to a close. I obviously skipped over a ton of counterspells, and if I passed over one of your favorite hidden gems, let us know in the comments. I'd really love to talk about some more of these in a multifaceted episode at some point. I also didn't really talk about the commanders who dictate what kind of counterspells you may want to run, and I didn't dig into other colors' counterspells very much, apart from a few multicolored honorable mentions. So there's still a lot to discuss. You can find us on YouTube at Gemstone Mind Podcast, and if you enjoyed this episode, please consider giving us a like, subscribing to the channel, and leaving a comment. You can also add us on Twitter, GemstoneMindMTG, or you can email us, gemstonemindpodcast@gmail.com. Until next time, I'm John, and this is Gemstone Mind.